For as long as I could remember, my family had always expected certain things from me. Things I didn't want or need. At 35, I had everything I could want: a fulfilling career, the freedom to travel, and a life that was my own. I had never felt the urge to have children, and I had no regrets about it. My life was mine to shape, on my terms. But every year, when the family reunion rolled around, it felt as though my life was constantly under a microscope. The reunion should have been a time to relax, to catch up, and maybe even laugh about old memories, but it never felt like that. The moment I walked into the house, the air felt thick with judgment. It wasn't just the usual questions. It was as if everyone had been rehearsing the same lines for months. The subtle glances exchanged between my aunts, the way they smiled just a little too brightly, and then the loaded questions. "You're still single?" my cousin Patricia asked, almost too loud for comfort, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Patricia, with her 3 kids and social media posts about their every little achievement, looked at me with a kind of pity. "It must be nice to have all that time. What do you even do with yourself?" I shrugged it off with a smile. But inside, I was boiling. Why did they think my life was so incomplete? Because I didn't fit into their mold. I didn't need children to validate my life. Yet, every year, it felt like I had to prove that I was just fine. And it wasn't just Patricia. Soon, someone else joined in with their story of how life only really began after they had kids. Another cousin followed with the classic, "Have you ever considered adoption? It's not too late." But it gets harder as you get older. It was a coordinated attack, a routine performance designed to make me feel small, to make me question my life choices. They always spoke with that fakeness, pretending to be helpful, but the judgment was as sharp as a knife. Even my mother joined in, her voice, casual as ever, floated over the conversation. "You're wasting your best years. Every woman should experience the joy of motherhood." My dad nodded in agreement, throwing in a comment about how they would have loved more grandkids. I tried to redirect the conversation, mentioning my career accomplishments and personal milestones, but it never mattered. In this room, the only currency that mattered was diapers, school report cards, and family photos. As the evening wore on, the topic shifted to my younger sister, Laura. I always lived in her shadow. Laura was beautiful, charming, and always the center of attention. She had everything until she didn't. Laura had gotten pregnant at one, dropped out of college, and fell into the wrong crowd. Addiction followed, and with it, a series of poor decisions. Eventually, she disappeared from our lives entirely. The last time I saw her was years ago at a court-mandated family therapy session. She stormed out, and that was the last anyone had heard from her. When her name came up during the reunion, the room quieted. It was like the family had collectively decided to not dwell on it. We weren't supposed to mention Laura's mistakes. It was an uncomfortable silence, a collective decision to brush it all under the rug. Then, as if it were a casual afterthought, my aunt dropped the bombshell. "Oh, by the way, Laura's son, Jamie, is in foster care now," she said, her voice void of any emotion, as if she were discussing the weather. "Well, you know how Laura is. She made her choices." The room moved on as if nothing had happened. I froze. My niece? Jamie, a 10-year-old boy, abandoned by his mother and now living in foster care. I had never met him, but I knew who he was. The last I heard, he had been living with Laura and one of her boyfriends. But that relationship had clearly fallen apart. "What do you mean, he's in foster care?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, hoping for more details. My aunt shrugged, offering no real answer. "What can you do? Some people just don't make the right choices." No one in the room seemed to care, and I felt like the only one who was processing the gravity of the situation. Jamie, a child who needed love and stability, was being shuffled between foster homes, and here they were, lecturing me about family values and responsibility. It felt like a punch to the gut. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about Jamie. My family had completely dismissed him. They had written him off as another casualty of Laura's mistakes. But for me, it didn't sit right. A child should never be forgotten. Jamie wasn't just some story I could ignore. He was flesh and blood, and he deserved better than what my family had given him. Nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something. My family had turned their backs on Jamie, but that didn't mean I had to. The more I thought about it, the more I knew that I had to find out more about his situation. If my family wasn't going to step up, then maybe it was time for me to step in. I started making calls. First, to the social worker who was handling Jamie's case. I needed to know where he was, what his situation was, and most importantly, if there was anything I could do to help. The conversation wasn't easy. I learned that Jamie had been in the system for a while, moving between foster homes. The social worker mentioned that he had behavioral issues, which didn't surprise me. After everything he'd been through, it was a miracle he wasn't worse off. But what really hit me was when she mentioned that he had trust issues and could be difficult to approach. Despite the challenges, I wasn't going to back down. Jamie needed someone, and if no one else would be that person, then it had to be me. The social worker agreed to arrange a supervised visit. She warned me to manage my expectations. Jamie was a child who had been through so much, and meeting someone new could be overwhelming. But I knew I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I spent the next week preparing for my first visit. The foster care center was nothing fancy, a small building that had seen better days. I wasn't sure what to expect when I walked in, but I knew I had to be patient. Jamie had been through enough trauma. The last thing he needed was to feel pushed into something he wasn't ready for. When I finally met Jamie, He didn't look up at me right away. He was sitting at a table, drawing on a piece of paper. His hair was messy, and he looked much smaller than I expected for a 10-year-old. I sat down across from him, trying to act calm, but inside I was anything but. The social worker introduced me as his aunt. Jamie glanced at me, but it was clear he didn't trust me. He didn't even stop drawing. I didn't want to pressure him, so I just commented on his drawing, complimenting him on the robot he was sketching. He mumbled a quiet thanks, but didn't say much else. The visit was awkward and quiet, but something inside me clicked. I didn't expect him to open up, but I could feel a pull toward him. He was hurting, and he didn't trust anyone, not even family. But that wasn't going to stop me from trying to be the one person he could rely on. The first few visits with Jamie were nothing like I had imagined. I had hoped for some breakthrough moment where he would open up, and we'd bond instantly, but that wasn't how it happened. He was cautious, reserved, and guarded, understandably so, given what he'd been through. Every time I walked into the foster center, I was met with his suspicious eyes, his tiny frame hunched over as he drew, his world shrinking in the art he created. His quiet demeanor spoke volumes to me, but it didn't deter me. One day, I brought him a sketchbook, something I knew would mean something to him. When I handed it to him, his eyes lit up for the first time. The joy on his face, the spark in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. Art was his escape, his therapy. Slowly, we began to share more moments. Small but meaningful ones, me complimenting his drawings, him explaining his thoughts on them. For the first time, I felt like we were breaking through the invisible wall he had built around himself. But even with these small victories, the weight of the situation didn't me. Each visit was emotionally exhausting, and each time I left the foster care, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. Jamie was slowly coming to trust me, but I knew this would take time. He had been abandoned, moved from home to home, and now here I was, another stranger in his life. The slow, delicate nature of our connection felt both painful and beautiful, as if we were both learning how to be a family. I knew that this wasn't just about me and Jamie anymore. This was about creating something real for him, something stable, and that wasn't just going to happen in a few weeks. It was going to take years, but I was committed. When I returned home that evening, the reality of what I was getting myself into settled deeper in my bones. The more I learned about Jamie's life, the more I realized just how much I had to prepare myself for. There was no going back now. I was already emotionally invested, but what came next would test every part of me. By now, I had started the process to officially adopt Jamie. I wasn't naive. I knew how hard it would be. But what surprised me was the backlash from my family. I'd expected some resistance, but I never thought it would be this severe. My parents were furious when they found out I was pursuing adoption. They accused me of embarrassing the family and bringing shame upon them. My mother said, with her usual dismissive tone, that I was stealing Laura's child. It was laughable. Honestly, my family had written Jamie off. They had dismissed him as just another casualty of Laura's poor choices. The idea that they would now accuse me of stealing her child made my blood boil. But it wasn't just about the words. It was about the complete lack of care they had shown Jamie. I knew my decision to adopt Jamie wasn't going to be popular with my family, but their response was more than I expected. It wasn't just that they didn't support me. They actively tried to stop me. They ignored my pleas to step up and help Jamie, yet they had no qualms about publicly shaming me for taking responsibility. I couldn't help but feel betrayed. These were the same people who had criticized me for not having children. Yet, when I was finally stepping up to care for someone in need, they turned their backs on me. It was clear that the only family value they truly held dear was biological ties. In their eyes, I had done something wrong by choosing to help Jamie, and the hypocrisy stung. The hardest part was the constant judgment from my parents. My mom even sent me a letter, accusing me of making a mistake that would haunt me forever. But I wasn't going to back down. I had seen the way Jamie lit up when he drew, the way he started to trust me, and the way he was slowly becoming more comfortable in his new life. He needed me, and that was all that mattered. I realized in that moment that I wasn't doing this for anyone else. I wasn't adopting Jamie to prove something to my family or to silence their judgment. I was doing this for him, for the boy who had been abandoned by his mother, dismissed by everyone around him, and shuffled from one foster home to next. Jamie needed me, and I wasn't going to let him slip through the cracks. The days following my decision to pursue adoption were a whirlwind of paperwork, court dates, and emotional upheaval, as expected. There were challenges, but what truly took me by surprise was how quickly Jamie began to settle into his new life. He wasn't just a child I was taking in. He was someone who needed to rebuild everything he'd ever known. I had prepared myself for the worst, but what I didn't anticipate was how quickly Jamie started to flourish in the new space I'd created for him. His room, once just a small, cold space in the foster home, was now a place he could truly call home. I painted the walls a soft blue, added shelves for his sketchbooks, and filled it with all the things I knew he loved: robot figurines, superhero posters, and a little desk where he could create. His art was the window to his soul, and slowly, I began to see the real Jamie. The one who wasn't just a scared, neglected child, but a talented, bright kid with so much potential. The first time he called me mom took me completely off guard. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, and suddenly, he just looked at me and said, "Thanks, Mom, for everything." I froze, my heart swelling with emotions I couldn't quite process. It wasn't something I had expected. It wasn't something I had pushed for. But in that moment, It felt right. It was the first time I truly felt like we were building a family, a real one, and not just two people trying to make do in a broken system. The process of adoption continued to progress. I had made the necessary adjustments to my life, rearranged my finances, prepared for the home inspection, and ensured everything was in order. I was nervous about the inspection, but it was far less invasive than I had imagined. The social worker walked through my house, making notes and asking questions. But when she got to Jamie's room, she smiled. "He's going to feel at home here," she said, nodding in approval. It felt like a moment of validation, a sign that maybe, just maybe, everything I had been doing was working. But as much as I was focused on the practical steps of adoption, it was the small moments that truly defined our journey. Jamie's first real birthday party, his excitement over new us, and the first time he smiled genuinely in my presence. Those were the moments that made every step worthwhile. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. My family's resistance continued to grow. As Jamie and I started building our lives together, the whispers and accusations grew louder. My parents remained firm in their stance, accusing me of making a mistake, of trying to erase Laura from Jamie's life. The negativity they directed my way only strengthened my resolve. I didn't need their approval. What mattered most was Jamie, his well-being, and the future we were creating together. Jamie's school progress was another area of concern. Though his art was flourishing, his grades were not. I knew it wasn't just about schoolwork. It was about the emotional scars that were still present. Jamie had been through so much already, and the frustration he felt in school often translated into anger at home. I worked with his teachers to find solutions, enrolling him in a weekend art class that sparked a passion in him. It was the first time I saw him truly excited about something. Outside of drawing robots, there were still setbacks. Of course, Jamie struggled with his self-worth, sometimes even questioning if he really belonged in this new life I was trying to give him. One afternoon, while I was cooking dinner, he came into the kitchen, his face tight with worry. "You're not going to get rid of me, right? Like my mom did?" he asked, his voice small, vulnerable. The question broke my heart, but I held him close. "No, Jamie, you're my family forever. I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, I knew that this wasn't just about proving something to my family or silencing their criticism. It was about creating a stable, loving home for Jamie, one where he would never have to wonder if he was wanted again. It wasn't going to be easy, but together, we would heal. As the months passed, we continued to grow closer. Jamie started to open up more, sharing his hopes and dreams with me. He talked about wanting to be an artist when he grew up, and the idea of visiting big cities, exploring museums, and seeing his artwork displayed. I encouraged him every step of the way, knowing that his confidence was slowly building. Despite the continued drama from my family, I stayed focused on the task and giving Jamie the best possible future. The more I saw him thrive, the more I knew I had made the right choice. The transformation wasn't just in him, it was in me, too. I had started this journey thinking I was doing something for him, but in reality, he was giving me something I never knew I did. A chance to rebuild, to give love without conditions, and to create a family based on trust, growth, and mutual support. But the final hurdle was yet to come. I had to face my family one last time. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and it felt like everything I had worked for was riding on this moment. I wasn't naive enough to believe that my family would suddenly accept my decision to adopt Jamie, but I had to be there, in that courtroom, fighting for what was right for me, and for the life we had built together. My parents didn't attend, but the court was filled with others, friends, acquaintances, and even distant relatives who had heard about what I was doing. The judge listened carefully to both sides, and when Jamie's turn came, I was holding my breath. He walked up to the stand, his eyes wide but determined, and spoke clearly. "I want to stay with my aunt. She makes me feel safe," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "She's the only one who's ever really cared about me." It was the moment that sealed everything. The judge's ruling was swift. Jamie was mine. The adoption was granted. The moment we left the courtroom, Jamie clutched my hand, his eyes shining with tears. "You're my mom," he said again, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And for the first time, I didn't hesitate. I pulled him into a hug, whispering, "Always." As we walked out into the sunlight, I knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, but we had already overcome the hardest part. We had become a family,